The millionaire heard his daughter scream, "Mom!" and what he did next changed everything. The sound tore through the afternoon like glass. It came from the rose lawn between the villa and the drive, thin and urgent and impossibly young. Amelia's small body was a frantic knot of movement and sobs. She had never called anyone Mom since the accident 2 years ago. Not to any of the nurses, not to the school teachers, not even to her father. She did not speak then, not really. She had learned silence the way some people learn a language. But now she was screaming the single word at the woman next to her, Lucía, pressing a face full of rain and new breath against the woman's knee. Lucia's palms went instantly to Amelia's shoulders, steady and careful. She smelled of coffee and citrus soap and something gentler, laundry warmed by sun, a dozen afternoons of rocking a baby she wasn't paid to love. Amelia clung to that scent as if it were a spell. Leandro Villalba del Sol stood frozen beneath the plane trees, his polished shoes on the gravel, the weight of his name like a dry coin in his chest. Builders had plastered his hotels across the coast. Investors wrote him into magazines. His calendar had more signatures than he had friends. He had been built by order and insistence. Today, he could not order the scream away. Neighbors stepped back. Gardeners paused with shears midair. In the house, a nanny held her hand to her mouth and looked at him like a question. His assistant, precise, clinical in a beige suit, had a phone already out, fingers poised. Across the lawn, Lucía did not look at him with pleading or apology. She looked at Amelia, and in the way a woman who had known a child before she had been born looks, she moved as if there had been a plan all along. If this opening grabbed you, stay with the story for a moment. Amelia's voice, when it came, was not a claim of ownership. It was an ache made of the word his life could not buy back. Mom. Leandro had not expected to be stopped by one small word. He had expected board meetings and receipts, and the quiet satisfaction of being able to replace things. Cars, staff, smiles. He had not expected to be undone in front of the whole block by a girl who, for 2 years, had learned the economy of silence. The woman on her knees was not his wife. She had never been. Lucía Cardenas had been hired 4 months earlier through an agency that specialized in household staff for wealthy families. She had arrived with a single suitcase, a soft laugh, and a movement that reminded Amelia of something she didn't yet have language for. She wore her hair in a braid that smelled of boiled cinnamon and lime. When she leaned forward to tuck a stray curl behind Amelia's ear, the child's fingers tightened around the braid, as if the scent itself had lines of memory. Leandro moved because he had to. He moved because someone else needed him to move.
He crossed the grass in a few long strides and found himself between them, between the woman and the child, between the past and a possibility that wasn't in any contract. He heard his voice and barely recognized it. "Amelia," he said, "what are you doing?" Amelia didn't look at him. She looked at Lucía as though the older woman were a lighthouse. "Mom," she said again, a small repetition that rang like a bell. A neighbor muttered to another neighbor, "Is that—" The question died in the heat. Leandro's assistant took a breath to say something rational, protocol, privacy, clarification. A small, rigid exhale meant to calm. The sound of it irritated him. He had spent his life making decisions so pets, hotels, and people worked exactly the way they should. This refusal, could not be managed with a manager's checklist. Lucía's voice was low. "It's okay, little one," she said, not translating the word into explanation, but into hold and steadiness. She pressed her forehead against Amelia's temple for a moment, then looked at Leandro with a kind of measured courage that he found disarming. That afternoon he walked away with more than he had come to take. He walked back into the dark glass of his house, where his life was displayed like trophies, shelves of awards, rows of photos with current presidents and mayors, a mantel framed by professional portraits of him and the late Isabel, always Isabel smiling at the camera, hair luminous. He had the instinct to put the afternoon in a file labeled domestic and to call the agency. Instead, he found himself watching a short video on his phone. It was a clip from 2 years ago, shot on an old camera phone, Isabel laughing in the sunlight of a small kitchen, symphony of steam and children's laughter in the background. Her voice was younger in the clip. She had been new to motherhood and reckless with love, as some women are. The video looped, Amelia toddling around,
Isabel lifting her high, calling her by nicknames. When the accident happened, one of those sudden public tragedies that people lean forward to watch, those same videos became evidence in a way only grief can produce. People sent messages. Flowers replace a conversation. Amelia closed up like a shell. Doctors called it selective mutism at times, then grief-induced withdrawal, then a cluster of other terms. Leandro signed forms, nighed in meetings, attended the rituals of healing that the wealthy attend when they cannot somehow fix what has been lost. He planted trees in memorials, and mediated interviews with charity boards. He put Amelia in the best private programs, in speech therapy, in playgroups. He filled the house with caretakers, all different from Isabel in the pastel and formal way they touched. None of it had been enough. The first months after Isabel's death, the house felt like a hotel in mourning. He did what men like him do. He moved forward. He launched a new wing in a hotel.
He took on a renovation project with his name attached. He sponsored a children's ward with his photo in the foyer. He thought these acts would seal a place in the world for the woman he loved. They did not seal the small private place his daughter needed. Lucia's arrival was unremarkable. The agency had written that she had extensive childcare experience, that she was reliable, pleasant demeanor, that she kept confidentiality. The paper said little about the unscripted, small things. Lucia liked her coffee black. She hummed lullabies to herself when she folded Amelia's tiny shirts. She did not correct Amelia's silence. She learned to share it. When she first held Amelia, the little girl had laid her head on Lucia's chest and listened to the rhythm there. A worker at the agency told Leandro's assistant, "She used to volunteer at a community clinic. She has a way with babies." The words were vague. They meant very little, until that day on the lawn. After the scream, Leandro did the practical things his life required. He spoke with the assistant. He stitched the afternoon into instructions that would become a meeting. He had a meeting scheduled for the next morning with Dr. Sofia Lorente, the psychologist who had been Amelia's clinician since the first months after the accident. Dr. Lorente's name carried authority in their circles, quiet, precise, a woman who preferred notes to speeches and numbers to platitudes. Her reports were clean. Leandro sat in the pale office of Dr. Lorente the following morning. He watched the way she arranged a pen in her hand, a tiny ritual that made him suddenly small. She was in her 40s, her hair streaked with gray at the temples in an arrangement that read efficiency more than fashion. Her voice was clinical, a lineage of classroom and clinic. "You have records of today's event?" she asked. He handed her the phone. The clip of Amelia on the lawn was short, but in the way images do, it made a case stronger than memory. He found himself explaining, not defending. "She hasn't said Mom since the funeral. She doesn't let anyone get close. And then this woman, Lucía," Dr. Lorente said. "She had done her homework. I saw her on the intake notes." "You saw her?" He leaned forward because the room felt suddenly too small. "She is competent," the doctor said, not hostile. "She is competent in caregiving. But competency is not the same as attachment work. Transfer or attachment behavior can be adaptive in the short term. It can also indicate a pattern where a child, desperate for safety, latches onto a figure in a way that harms her," the assistant finished in the doorway as if the sentence were a diagnosis. "May interfere with long-term therapy," Dr. Lorente finished. "Amelia's silence is a response to complex trauma. The presence of a non-parent caregiver forming an intimate attachment without therapeutic supervision can complicate existing progress."
There are cases where what appears to be healing is actually a symptom of displaced attachment. Leandro watched the doctor make charts with blunt precision. He had believed he could outspend pain. He had thought investment equals optimization. He had thought people were systems you could engineer if you had enough capital. Dr. Lorente did not think in capital. She thought in variables and trajectories. She could see patterns and outline probabilities. Leandro felt both reassured and exposed. "Are you saying we should remove her?" he asked, the question tasting like a command. "I am recommending evaluation," Dr. Lorente said, "an assessment of the attachment patterns and supervised separation. It may be prudent to temporarily limit unsupervised contact until we've completed a plan." The word temporarily was a small instruction. It carried the weight of a doorway that could slam shut. Leandro's chest tightened. The rational man in him wanted protocols. The father wanted what felt immediate and human. "You think she is a danger?" he asked quietly. "I think there is evidence of transfer-like attachment," Dr. Loyent said. That makes it an ethical responsibility to recommend a course that protects the child while we evaluate. She was careful. She did not say Lucía was malicious. She did not need to. Her caution fell into the vacuum of the household like a cold draft. In the absence of intimacy, suspicion always fills the space. Lucía had chosen work where faces were small and trust was necessary. Now trust could be parsed like a threat. Leandro sat with the report like a patient holding a test he could not fully read. He had expected a simple verdict. He had not expected the moral gray to be so to be. He called the agency. He scheduled a meeting with his legal counsel. He ordered that Lucía not be given any access to internet accounts or passwords, a meaningless formality that comforted him. He told himself he was protecting Amelia because protecting was what he had always done. But the word protect had begun to schism the house. Was protecting the same as owning the response? He moved through the next days like someone performing a ritual. Lucía, for her part, continued to show up the way a steady current does, wrapping Amelia in blankets, humming without expectation, preparing cocoa by careful measurement as sugar and milk, pressing a spoon to a child's lips until the child accepted food again. She did not argue with Leandro. She did not rail against the words that slid across reports and recommendations. She worked as she had always worked, with hands that understood small economies of comfort. Those hands knew the small complexities of survival. Lucía had arrived to town with a history that would not be in a background check. She had spent one spring volunteering at a community health clinic where Isabel had also come, pregnant and nervous, to ask for help with a minor fever, and later for advice about childbirth.
Lucía had started as a volunteer, sewing small blankets, helping with prenatal classes. She had watched Isabel bring Amelia into the world. She had, in the quiet of shared kitchens and waiting rooms, become one of the few people who knew how Amelia calmed when Lucía's palm rested on Isabel's own belly during a prenatal visit. At the time, Isabel had laughed and said it was ridiculous. Babies know their people, she told Lucía, then wrote a note that later would read like a promise. No one in the house knew this. They had contracts and schedules and a polite distance. The note, if it existed, was a private thing between two women in a silence of spinning days. But Amelia's body kept an archive that paperwork could not access. She remembered scent before she remembered names. After the doctor's recommendation, Leandro made the practical call he had rehearsed. He told his assistant to terminate Lucía's employment. He gave the agency a directive and signed the forms. The termination was, in his mind, an act of parental prudence. To a man with long habits of decisive action, it felt like closing a file. Lucía packed quietly. She knelt on the floor and folded Amelia's small sweaters, folding them carefully as someone folds a living thing. She left a bag with a few extras by the back door, like a small apology. When she turned to Amelia, the child sat on the couch with her knees tucked up, a book unopened in her lap. Amelia looked up when Lucía touched her shoulder. "You're leaving," she said. She had the habit of making short sentences like commands. The syllables were like stepping stones back across a river. "Why?" Lucía gathered her in her arms. When she held Amelia, she hummed the same lullaby she had hummed when folding shirts. That sound was not a protest. It was the only language she had that might translate sorrow. "For a little while," Lucía said, "to keep you safe." Amelia clung to her and closed her eyes, the set of them like a little treaty. When Lucía kissed the top of her head, the child inhaled sharply and then resumed a small, careful breathing pattern she reserved for holding on. The house felt heavier for the absence of motion, for the way the sunlight fell on the empty side of the couch. The next day, Amelia stopped eating as much. A therapist visited and wrote notes in a folder everyone read, but none of them could change the way a child chooses to keep her world narrow. She stopped speaking to other visitors altogether. The teacher emailed that her handwriting had become smaller. Leandro found himself in a fog of increasingly clinical words: withdrawal, regression, adaptive survival, as if naming the state would unmake it. That evening, after a day of calls and logistics, Leandro stood in the doorway of his daughter's room and watched a woman he had dismissed brush the child's hair in a memory he'd only half believed existed. He had fired Lucía. He had said the words because the doctor told him it might be safest. He had meant to be calm, to be correct. Instead, he had watched the child tighten into a smaller shape with each passing hour. "She refused to eat today," the nanny said. The kind of sentence that reports facts and scores the house on a scale of failure.
Then we'll bring in a specialist, Leandro replied automatically. Then said it again in the quiet of the room. We will not lose her. He didn't mean to call Lucía that night. He meant to call the agency, or the doctor, or to arrange for a different, more clinical solution. But the fact that he reached for the phone and dialed a number that wasn't in a file said more than his meetings ever could. He heard the line click. A voice answered, sleepy and soft. Hola? It's Leandro, feeling ridiculous for explaining himself. Lucía? A pause. In the space between his breath and hers, a life had stacked small obligations. Yes, she answered. Can you come back? He asked. The question hung there as if it might have been a different currency in another life. Under the weight of his hesitation was something else. Shame. He had always made decisions by certainty and authority. Here he had been wrong. He had been hasty. His training had taught him to correct error with competence. But there are mistakes that bind like rope. They require a different kind of untying. Come now, he said. Please. She arrived within the hour, without fanfare. She came through the back gate carrying a small bag. The house smelled of lemon oil and expensive upholstery. When she reached Amelia's room, the child sat in the middle of the rug, as if remediating a world through proximity to the floor. Lucía sat down and put the bag next to her. From that bag she culled an object. A small wooden box, worn at the edges, with a brass latch that glinted in the light. Leandro had never seen the box before. It looked like something that belonged in a different world, handmade, the wood polished by long fingers and an older hand. He told himself he would not be nosy. He told himself that the box was personal, and that he had made his bed. He told himself many things, and then, because curiosity is often more honest than principle, he moved toward the door just enough to catch the word that left Lucía's mouth when she lifted the latch. It's a promise, she said. And for the first time since the scream, she had meant something other than prescribed duty. She opened the box slowly. Inside were folded papers, the edges softened by handling. There was a faded photograph of Isabel holding a newborn, her hair a halo of sun. There were small trinkets, a pressed wildflower, a tiny knitted mitten, and there were letters. Leandro did not immediately recognize the handwriting, since he had not read Isabel's private words in a long time. He stepped back, feeling like an intruder in a private geography. Lucía reached for a particular envelope, unfolded it with a care that made her hands show the line of experience.
She read aloud, and because the letter was from Isabel, the world around them shifted the shade of grief into something else: obligation, memory, and a strange map of trust. I asked you to promise, Lucía read. The paper seemed to keep Isabel's voice the way the housekeepers kept the silver. If something happens to me, if the road takes me away, if the world is unjust and I cannot be there, will you promise to be Amalia's other mother? Will you be the voice that says yes when she forgets how to say hello to the morning? Promise.
Leandro felt his throat close. The name in the letter, Amelia, a small variation of the child's name, was a private pet form meant only for the inner rooms of their lives. When Isabel had written the note, she had placed her trust in Lucía not as a contract, but as an ethical testament, an unfolding of the messy, lived truth that people sometimes hold each other's children without paper to authorize the claim. "She was at the clinic when Isabel came," Lucía said quietly. "She would let me touch her belly during group classes. She would look like she recognized me then. Isabel said, she said the baby calmed when my hand was there." "Calmed?" Leandro repeated. "She wrote it down," Lucía said. "Isabel wrote she wanted me to know her people. She wrote to say, if anything happens, would you?" The words knifed the air between them. Leandro felt his entire house shrink to the size of the wooden box. He had been absent in ways that money could not reconcile. A note in a box demanded more than apology. It demanded action. It also demanded reading himself as a man who could be wrong. He took the letter from her hand as if it were a thing that could be held and not felt. The writing was Isabel's, tilted, certain in certain strokes, tender in others, in a line that sat like a private hymn she had written. "I know this sounds strange. Maybe it is only me, but she held my hand one day and kissed it like a child who'd learned the edges of safety. That hand is hers if I am taken." The room hummed with the weight of said things. Leandro felt a dozen responses at once: relief, rage, grief, envy. He had not known Isabel in all the ways she had known people. He had not noticed the small faiths that passed between his wife and the women who made their lives possible. He had been present in a different way, a man who arrived with money and left with appointments. He thought of Amelia's silence. He thought of the way the child had taken to Lucia's scent, citrus and cinnamon, and how the small being had moved toward it like an animal to water. He wondered whether he had been the one most fearful of the bond, fearful because it belonged to someone else, not because it was harmful. He shut the letter at that point, because the practical thing to do seemed ridiculous against this sudden surge of private proof. There was a photograph tucked inside the next envelope, Isabel at a community clinic, with Lucía beside her, both laughing.
The caption in Isabel's hand simply read, "She knows my heart's echo." Leandro did not immediately know what to do. He had mistakes to fix and a protocol to rescind. He had appointments to cancel and emails to send. He had to call whoever had recommended the firing and say they were wrong. He had to tell Dr. Lorente that evidence had changed. He had to reconcile professional caution with the living testimony of his wife's handwriting. But more than the practicalities, there was a swell of rawness, felt rather than thought. He had been trained to make decisions from distance, but here the distance had been the problem. He realized he had to close a gap that money could not bridge. He had to do more than reinstate a staffer. He had to stand in front of a ritual he had avoided since Isabel's funeral, the ritual of naming one's own failing and accepting that love comes outside the sphere of contracts. He reached for his phone. His hand felt strange, small. He dialed the agency's number not to hire, but to reverse. "Bring her back," he said to the woman who answered, voice firm now in a way that did not feel like authority, but like admission. "Bring Lucía back." By the time night fell, Lucía was back in the house, not because of the paperwork, but because a man who had learned how to make impossibilities practical had decided to risk being vulnerable. He met her at the back gate and held out a folded envelope, an awkward hands-in-pocket peace offering, because he had no other way to translate the apology that was owed. Lucía accepted without comment. She walked into the house looking like someone who had come to finish a job she had not expected to be personal. Amelia watched from the hallway, eyes like two small moons. She did not run to him. She went to Lucía, and when her small fingers found the braid again, the house exhaled. For an hour, everything seemed to adjust. Lucía put Amelia to bed, humming the same low tune she had hummed in the clinic a year ago. Leandro sat in the den and watched the video of Isabel again, this time with the knowledge of the letter like a lens. In the recording, Isabel's laughter was bright, and there was a point where she looked at the camera and said something that now felt like prophecy. "There are people who cannot be replaced," she had said, "but there are people the world gifts us when we need them." It felt like an explanation,
and yet it left a residue of unease. He had reinstated Lucía out of something that felt like rightness, but Dr. Llorente's warning still sat in his inbox like a polite threat. He had not resolved the professional opinion, which now stood in tension with a private testament written by his late wife. He could not simply live in a house of sentiment. His life required navigation of both systems and human spirits. The next morning, the assistant brought him a new message. Dr. Llorente had filed a formal note recommending a supervised evaluation.
It was not a petition yet, but the process was the thing that made Leandro's chest tighten. The house now had two competing logics: care and procedure, tenderness and policy. On the third day after Lucía's return, Amelia ate cereal again. The bowl trembled under her small fingers, the way a hand trembles when relearning trust. Lucía sat beside her, stirring sugar into a cup of coffee for herself. The smell of boiled cinnamon and citrus soap rose in the kitchen like an aromatic map of safety. That man wanted to comply. He wanted to be correct. He wanted to not be the reason his child was harmed. But impulses do not always come in clear fiscal terms. Some obligations are not to stakeholders, but to fragile live things that do not invoice you. 2 nights later, Amelia slept with a small fist curled into her hair, a remnant of childhood clinging to the pillow. The house hummed with air conditioning and the faint swell of a late-night news segment about the city's new development plan. Leandro walked into the kitchen and found Lucía sitting at the table, reading one of Isabel's letters. The lamp above them cast a small pool of warmth, and the smell of coffee rose like a low prayer. "You shouldn't read those," he said, but it was not a reproach. It was the voice of someone who realized his life had been a series of misplaced priorities. Lucía looked up. "She asked me to keep them safe," she said simply. "She asked me to remember." "Remember what?" he asked. "That she trusted me," Lucía said. Her voice was steady. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, as if keeping it there would keep each inked promise alive. He thought of the day on the lawn and the photo tucked into the box. He thought about the way he had been frozen, the way his daughter had been small and brave and suddenly loud when she needed to be. The sense of being outmaneuvered by something he could not quantify, by scent and comfort and the last living traces of his wife's hands, stung worse than any business defeat. He slept poorly that night. He woke with a noise in his head that wasn't the hum of the city or the clatter of the kitchen. It was the small sound of his child's breath. The next morning, Leandro made a decision that would alter the shape of their household. He called an assistant and issued orders not as commands, but as a request, to schedule a family meeting for that afternoon. Himself, Lucía, Dr. Loriente, and the legal consultant. He wanted them all in the same room, not to adjudicate, but to listen. He did not yet know how to frame it. He only knew he was tired of being told the right thing to do by men who saw life as a series of lines on a balance sheet. When they sat in the sunroom that afternoon, the glass framed their faces like paper cutouts. Dr. Loriente arrived with a folder that contained notes and a soft, careful readiness to speak. She moved with the economy of someone who knew that words could both heal and sever. Lucía sat with her hands folded, the wooden box at her feet. Leandro sat across from them, his posture unreadable. "We're here to send her Amelia," Dr. Loriente began, the way a doctor begins any meeting, to decide how to proceed in a way that's safe and effective. Leandro watched her watch the people in the room. He had once been watched like that, in boardrooms, on stages. The experience of being observed for decision-making did not comfort him now. It made him feel smaller in the face of the child's need.
"Does anyone have objections to listening first?" Dr. Loriente asked. Lucía did not object. She spoke in the voice that had borne her through volunteer clinics and summer nights with children. "I was with Isabel when she was pregnant," she said. "She asked me to be there if she couldn't. That is all. I know this is complicated for you. I only wanted to help Amelia. She calmed with me." Dr. Lorente's expression did not harden. It simply remained attentive. "Your involvement has been beneficial in practical ways," she said, "but we must differentiate between functional caregiving and an attachment that may interfere with therapeutic goals." Leandro felt a sudden surge of impatience. "She is the one person my daughter goes to when the world is loud," he said. "You say may interfere. How else do you want us to proceed?" The doctor answered with the steady cadence of someone not surprised by the question. "A formal evaluation, limited on supervised contact until the evaluation is complete, and a care plan," she said. "Safety is our guide." "Safety," Leandro echoed, tasting the word as if it might help. "But safety isn't just about risk. It's also about who keeps the light on when my daughter cannot." A silence fell that was not heavy but pregnant. Dr. Loriente did not flinch. She balanced her professional caution with an open nod. "All of those subjective factors matter. They matter in court. They matter in therapy. They matter in life." She paused.
but as a clinician, my duty is to recommend what I believe minimizes harm. It was a statement designed to clear the path to an unresolved conclusion. Leandro processed it as a man who had spent years clearing paths for projects. He felt boxed in by the ethical latticework of his daughter's welfare and his late wife's memory. He felt the house's rooms closing around him, contracts on one side, letters on another, and his child's small heartbeat in the middle. That night, after the meeting, Amelia slept with Lucía by her bedside. Lucía braided the child's hair the same way a seamstress makes lines that hold. Leandro sat outside the room on a chair that caught the moon's light and read one of Isabel's letters again, the one where she had used the word promise. He thought of all the things he could do as a man with means: hire lawyers, stage a defense, quote expert opinions. He also thought of the small things he had done wrong: missed dinners, too many business breakfasts, cables of absence braided into the child's days. He had been competent with construction and commerce. He was clumsy in the architecture of emotional trust. When he walked into the hallway, he saw Amelia spur and call for him in a voice so small it was almost a whisper. "Daddy," she murmured. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her. Her eyes were open, bright and unguarded in the way only small children can be when they are safe enough to show the edges of their hearts. I felt his own face soften without thought.
He reached out and tucked a bit of hair behind her ear, a small gesture that held the whole of apology. "Hey," he said. "It's me." For a moment, everything in his life, the hotels and the deals, the photos and the accolades, fell away to a single point. The sound of his daughter's breath was all he could take. He thought of the scream that had started this change, how it had ripped him from the comfortable fiction that he could always order life into submission. He knew then that the next decisions would not be made in boardrooms. They would be small acts, sitting on the floor to play, learning the tempo of someone else's lullaby, allowing a woman who had earned a promise to keep it. He would have to choose between the neat logic of distance and the messy labor of loving. The next morning, he drove to the small apartment Lucía had taken when she left town briefly after the termination. He had the letter in his jacket pocket, still warm from the folds of his hand. He had rehearsed what he would say, but rehearsed speeches felt impossible when the stakes were a child and a promise. He parked on the curb and stood for a long time before he knocked on the door. He noticed the worn steps, the smell of frying oil in the hallway, a plant pot with a sun-bleach tag. This place was the other side of his life. Stitchwork and small ovens and living rooms where space meant sleeping on a sofa. He felt the city's difference under his shoes. For the first time in a long time, the simple geography of life across class lines struck him as urgent. When the door opened, Lucía stood there with her hair in the same braid, a thin cardigan wrapped at the elbows, and a kettle still warm in her hands as if she had been about to make tea. She wore the small, careful look people get when the world shifts, and they have to decide what part of themselves to show. For a moment, they only looked at each other. Two people from different maps of the city who suddenly had to redraw a shared border. Leandro began, and the rehearsed words died. He felt awkward, ridiculous, human. "I read the letter," he said finally. "I want to apologize. Will you come home?" Lucía wiped her palms on the cardigan, her face folded a way I had not expected. No triumph, no dramatics, only a slow weighing of consequence. "I came back once you called," she answered, "but this isn't yours to ask alone." "No," he said. "It's mine to own, at least. Will you let me try to be different?" She considered the question as if it had texture. Outside, a bus coughed by. Above the street, a child's laughter floated down like a ribbon. "I don't want your apologies," she said, voice steady. "I want Amelia to be okay. If you're asking that, if you're asking to be present, then yes." He wanted to bow in relief. He wanted to promise more than he could keep.
Instead, he stood on a little stoop, feeling the city under his shoes and the weight of living choices in his chest. He left with an arrangement that felt precariously honest. They would try. They would do the hard, small things. Back at the villa, nothing about the house had changed. The trophies still held their same gleam. The gardens were still manicured. But somehow the rooms there had acquired a new use. Leandro began to attend the domestic details, to learn Amelia's favorite cereal brand, to take her to therapy appointments himself, to sit on the floor and let a wooden train derail across his socked feet. He learned to speak slowly when she looked frightened. He let Lucía carry the child into school when mornings became too loud. Little by little, the house learned how to be a home rather than a repository for someone else's grief. The professional process did not stop. Dr. Sofia Llorente,
consistent and exacting, moved the matter from recommendation to paperwork. Her caution translated into forms that started a clock, referrals, notifications to Child Protection Services, and the formal petition the clinic filed requesting a court-ordered assessment and limited contact during evaluation. For her, each step was an ethical requirement. For Leandro, each step was a tightening. Lucía received the notice and folded it into the wooden box, not as a defiant token, but as evidence that the world had rules that did not always align with good intentions. Social workers visited the house more often. They took notes in crisp notebooks. They observed interactions, how Lucía tied Amelia's shoelaces, how Leandro interrupted a tantrum not with a boardroom tone, but with a child's level of patience. The presence of the state was sober, banal, and at times sharp. It did not arrive with malice. It arrived with checklists. The day the petition was filed, Leandro felt like he'd been hauled through water. He met with his lawyer, who laid out the options: contest, negotiate, invite a neutral guardian ad litem to observe. Leandro chose the path that surprised even him. He authorized the release of the letter and the diaries. He signed off on making them part of the record. He did not want to fight his wife's memory. He wanted it weighed. The hearing was scheduled for a weekday morning. The courthouse smelled of coffee and paper, of varnish and something that made time feel official. The gallery had enough seats for people to sit and recognize what a family looked like when it came undone. There were reporters, an echo of his public life, but mostly there were quiet faces, neighbors who had watched the lawn, a social worker from the clinic, an attorney for the psychologist, and two people who would decide whether a woman's private promise could stand up to procedural scrutiny. Judge Ricardo took the bench with the kind of uncomplicated gravity that disarmed spectacle.
He was in his 60s, with a face that had been taught to measure testimony for fairness rather than for drama. He greeted the room with a nod and said simply, "We'll begin." The psychologist's counsel spoke first in precise terms: risk, best interest, professional opinion. Dr. Lorente described patterns in language she had not used in the sunroom. If a child develops an unsupervised attachment to a caregiver who is not a legal guardian, there can be long-term implications for therapy, for identity, and for safety. She clarified she was not alleging malice. She framed her recommendation as a duty to err on the side of structured evaluation. Her tone was not accusatory, it was procedural. That made it harder for anyone to paint her as a villain. Then they presented footage, short clips from home cameras showing Lucía calming Amelia when she became distressed, the way she fed her when she refused to eat, the gentle rhythm of hair braiding at bedtime. The images were not damning, they were ordinary acts of care. The psychologist's counsel asked whether this was evidence of concerning attachment. The images did not provide an answer, they provided a profile. Leandra's attorney stood and spoke with a different cadence. He did not aim to paint a picture of class warfare or to denigrate professional judgment. Instead, he invited the court to see the letter. He asked for the box to be entered into evidence. When the wooden box was opened in court and the faded papers were lifted into the light, the room shifted. A small hush fell like the sound of someone remembering prayer. The judge leaned forward when Leandro read aloud a passage from Isabel's handwriting. This time the letters were not simply private relics, but testimony. "I want you to promise that if I cannot be there, you will be someone's voice," Leandro read. "Not because law demands it, because law cannot hold a lap or a lullaby. Promise to be the other mother's hands." The words landed between the bench and the gallery. They were not legal proof, they were a moral appeal made in ink. They forced anyone present to reckon with what grief looks like when it is orderly, and what love looks like when it is not. The court called witnesses. Social workers explained protocols. Dr. Lorente described her plan for evaluation and emphasized the clinic's commitment to the child's welfare. Lucía's counsel presented character references: neighbors who had seen her volunteer at the clinic, parents who had trusted her with infants, a midwife who remembered Lucía's patient hands. They did not attempt to argue metaphysical claims. They rely on patterns of kindness and evidence of appropriate caregiving. When it came time for direct testimony, the room quieted in a way that felt like expectation. Judge Ricardo did something the law allows but few judges take lightly. He asked to speak with the child in private.
To the polite surprise of many, the judge requested a short private interview with Amelia, accompanied by a guardian ad litem, a social worker, and a court reporter, so that the child's voice could be honored without pressure. They returned after a measured interval. The judge's face was unchanged, but his eyes had a new kind of softness. "I spoke with Amelia," he told the room. "She answered in her own way. The transcript that followed felt like a small miracle of clarity. Amelia, in a room with colored paper and a cup of crayons, had been asked about the two women in her life. The recorder caught her answers nearly verbatim. "Who is Isabel?" the judge had asked gently. "First mother," Amelia answered, the phrase precise and soft, as if she were cataloging a treasure. "Who is Lucía?" the judge had asked. "Second mother," Amelia said. "She keeps the night from being loud." "Who told you the word mom?" the judge asked, curious in the way adults often are when they seek to parse what a child knows. Amelia had tilted her head, considering the question like one might examine a moth. "Isabel's hand and Lucia's smell," she said finally, finger tracing an imaginary scent across the air. "When they touch the place my heart is, it says home." The judge paused, writing. "Does anyone make you afraid?" he asked next, voice practiced. "No," she whispered. "I am not alone when I am with Lucía." The judge asked if she wanted to go to school, if she liked cakes, if she ever wanted Lucía to leave. Her answers were childlike and decisive. "No, I don't want her to go. She sings the quiet song." There were no grand pronouncements in that exchange, only small truths that a child's memory could hold and the adult world could not fully translate. But the testimony was enough to complicate the neat arguments of policy. In the courtroom, Dr. Lorente was given time to explain her position in light of Amelia's words. She remained composed. "A child's subjective report is important and can carry substantial weight," she said. "However, it must be considered alongside clinical evidence and possible risks. My recommendation has always been caution, not exclusion." Judge Ricardo nodded. "Words can be both refuge and risk," he said aloud, as if testing the phrase for weight. The courtroom's emotional apex arrived not with a theatrical outburst, but with a small decisive request from Leandro with an authenticity that pulled at the edges of his old posture. "I have spent most of my life solving problems by buying time or space," he said. "I am not proud of that. I misread what my daughter needed. My wife left me instructions in a way the law cannot own. Today I ask the court to consider that possibility. That promises and presence count for something. I ask you to allow us to try, under supervision, with oversight, and with every safeguard you need." Leandro did not seek to negate Dr. Lorente's expertise. He invited it.
"We will comply with evaluations," he said. "We will accept a plan. But I cannot strip away the person who holds my child when the world is too loud." The judge took time to consider. He conferred with the guardian ad litem, read social worker reports, reviewed the letter, the video evidence, and the clinician's notes. He allowed the rational legal arguments their due and kept returning to the child's voice, which in his notes had been recorded as sincere, consistent, and indicative of a primary comfort relationship. When the ruling came, it was careful and layered. Judge Ricardo rejected the petition to permanently remove Lucía or to order immediate institutionalization. He acknowledged the psychologist's concerns as legitimate and directed that a formal evaluation be completed within 30 days by a neutral specialist, with supervised visitation as recommended by Child Services during that interval. He ordered 6 months of supervised family services, structured therapy, regular social worker visits, and a pathway for a guardian ad litem to recommend further legal steps if appropriate. He emphasized that these measures were designed to protect the child while respecting her expressed attachments. "In matters of children," the judge said in the room that quieted for his words, "the law must weigh both technical evidence and human truth. It is not an either-or. It is a careful balance." For Leandro, the ruling felt like a partial victory that required humility. Not everything had been resolved in his favor, but the court had recognized the weight of Isabel's testimony and of the child's own words. For Lucía, it meant she could remain present, but under observation that would test her consistency and commitment. For Dr. Lorente, the decision affirmed her role in overseeing clinical care, without excising the relational reality she had found concerning. Outside the courthouse, cameras lingered, and condensing headlines tried to reduce complexity to a line. Leandro refused to play to spectacle. He drove home and took a different route, a quiet path that allowed him to avoid the glare. When he entered his daughter's room that evening, he sat on the floor and watched Lucía braid Amelia's hair. The scene had returned to ordinary intimacy, a spinning of string,
a hum of song. He felt for the first time since the lawn, not the need to command, but the desire to be part of the work. The next months passed in a rhythm of appointments and small victories. Supervised family services arrived like scaffolding, regular check-ins that sometimes felt like surveillance and sometimes like support. A neutral evaluator came and watched interactions, asked questions, and observed in ways that balanced clinical neutrality with humane observation. Dr. Lorente remained involved, consulting on therapeutic methods and meeting with the family to align strategies.
There were moments of friction. Papers misfiled, an overzealous report, a social worker with a different reading, but the dominant movement was toward repair. Amelia began to eat more regularly. She started to answer a few questions with more than one word. She let Leandro hold her at the park, and sometimes, late at night, she would reach across him to tuck her hand into Lucia's. Those gestures were not cures, they were steps along a path. Each step required patience. There were days when the house would feel as if it had been thrown back into a river, tearful evenings, sudden regressions, but the family began to learn how to swim together. Leandro changed in visible ways. He picked up small domestic tasks. One of the first things he learned was how to fold Amelia's sweaters the way Lucia did, and he began to attend PTA meetings, awkward in his tailored suits but present. He took Amelia to see the dentist, sat through therapy sessions, and learned how to read children's books with the inflection a small person needed. He also began to speak publicly about responsibility, not charm. He supported policies at his hotels that improved employees' maternity leave and childcare support, legislative gestures that felt like a man trying to stitch his business ethics to his personal ones. For Lucia, the supervised months required proving nothing to the court and everything to a child who already trusted her. She kept a log of Amelia's behaviors, met with counselors, and agreed to be part of family therapy sessions. She never sought to replace Isabel in words. She preferred small intimacies, the same soup recipe, a humming at bedtime, the way she smoothed a shirt collar for a child who wanted to be neat. She developed a cautious partnership with the professionals, accepting feedback while resisting the assumption that her care was something clinical rather than human. The community, too, began to settle into a new understanding. Neighbors who had once whispered behind hedges started to nod across the drive. The agency that had hired Lucia reviewed its onboarding and began to ask different questions about history and trust. The city clinic where Lucia had once volunteered received a modest grant from Leandro's foundation to improve prenatal services, an action that acknowledged Isabel's faith in communal care. Time, as it does, watered the sharp corners. 6 months later, Judge Ricardo reviewed the case with the benefit of reports that showed measured progress. Amelia's evaluator noted increased social engagement, the family therapist recorded cooperative co-parenting dynamics, and social services reported steady compliance with plans. The judge's final order acknowledged that while ongoing monitoring remained appropriate, the evidence favored keeping the child in the home with both caregivers active in her life. He recommended that Leandro and Lucia explore formal legal avenues to secure the child's safety, guardianship, or a custody formalization that would provide clear legal standing for Lucia in the child's life. The recommendation was not a decree of adoption, it was a pragmatic step toward stability. It allowed the family time to decide what formal association would best protect Amelia's future, without forcing them into choices they were not ready to make. Leandro accepted the recommendation. He did not rush. He engaged a lawyer to create a pathway that would allow Lucia to have legal recognition in a way that respected all parties. Life thereafter had a different balance of power. Where once contracts and purchases had been the tools Leandro used to shape reality, now it was presence and small consistency. He became a man who could hold a child's temper in one hand and his own vulnerability in the other. He apologized publicly and privately to the people who had been the thin scaffolding of his family's life. He wrote checks that mattered, scholarships at the clinic, fair wages for staff, and he changed policies at his hotels so that the people who kept other families afloat would be less precarious. Amelia's progress was not linear. There were nights when the old quiet returned, and she would tuck herself under blankets and not speak for hours. There were days when she would run across the lawn and call out, "Mom," and in that call wrap up 1,000 complicated truths. There were other moments she called out, "Daddy," with a joy that sounded like reclamation. The family learned to let the child's voice exist without trying to categorize it.
2 years after the lawn, the house was smaller in its pretenses and fuller in its life. Lucía had formalized some of her legal standing, signing documents that made her a recognized guardian with clear responsibilities and protections. The community that had once assumed class lines saw with a slow humility that love does not always follow the clean lines of blood. One warm summer night, months after the legal formalities had been set in place, Leandro found himself in a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and lavender. He was not at a press event or a charity inauguration. He was in a waiting room with a small bundle of nerves and hope. Lucía had come to the clinic for checkups. She had been carrying a child, an unanticipated life that felt like the final stitch in a family trying to mend. Isabel's handwriting had once said, "Promise." The new child's arrival felt like a living answer. Amelia, who was now 8, had insisted on coming to the hospital. She sat in the corner of the delivery room with a small bouquet of pressed wildflowers she had picked herself, eyes wide and protective. She had learned over seasons of therapy and court visits how to be both a child and a witness to adult commitments. She held both hands out and touched the small damp finger when the baby arrived.
They named him Mateo, a name that felt like an echo of a softer life. Leandro stood there with his hands trembling, not with the old pride of acquisition, but with something rawer, gratitude. He had learned a lesson he had not expected to learn. Some things cannot be bought. They must be earned through the steady accrual of ordinary acts. Later at home, with new life breathing in the house and a sound of a crib settling like low weather, the family gathered in the kitchen. Lucía stirred a pot of soup, the smell of cinnamon and citrus rising like a domestic benediction. Amelia laughed, a true small child's laugh that did not sound guarded, and ran her hands through Mateo's hair, the child's fingers soft and curious. Leandro sat at the table, unpolished, wearing a sweater his assistant would have once tutted at, and watched them. He had, in the months since the lawn, learned to let small moments dictate his measure of success. He thought of Isabel often, a presence in their lives that had not been erased by death. Her letters remained in the wooden box, a liturgy of promises. On the wall where her pictures had hung, they added a new frame, a simple image of the 3 women, Isabel in an old photograph, Lucía beside her, and Amelia between them, each face a chapter in a continuity that the law could not fully capture. There were small public gestures too. Leandro gave a short speech at a clinic benefit and spoke not as a man who had been vindicated, but as a man who had been corrected. He thanked people whose work had been invisible, noted the structural changes to his company's policies, and acknowledged that the city systems hadn't failed entirely, but needed better heart. He received some applause and some skeptical looks. He accepted both. Years later, when Mateo was old enough to chase his sister around the garden, Amelia would stop and press her forehead to Lucía's or to Leandro's, content to be held and not asked to choose who she loved. The wooden box stayed on a shelf in the den. Once in a while, when no one else was around, Leandro would take down the letters and read one aloud to Lucía, private rituals of thanks and remembrance. One line Isabel had written kept returning to him like a tide. Love is not only what we inherit, it is what we choose to keep. On an ordinary Sunday, as light poured through the kitchen in the way it does when weeks of rain have cleared, the 3 of them, Leandro, Lucía, and Amelia, sat at the table sharing pancakes. The smell of coffee and cinnamon braided with bacon and the citrus soap that clung to Lucía's sleeve. Amelia pressed a small hand in both of theirs, as if to anchor herself between 2 shores. "Mom," she said suddenly, and the word was small and steady, not a summons but a naming of belonging. She looked at Lucía and then at Leandro, and then at Mateo asleep in a cradle nearby.
It was not always the same mom that had pierced the lawn, that scream of need, but a softer, fuller call that suggested a life settling into shape. Leandro reached across the table and took Lucía's hand in both of his. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. The decision he had made the day he walked off that lawn, the one that altered the trajectory of a child's life and his own, had not been a spectacle. It had been a series of small commitments, attending, listening, correcting course when mistaken. Those choices had changed everything, in the way quiet things change the world, not by force, but by fidelity. If this story touched you,
Share it with someone who needs a reminder that presence and promises can matter more than money. They kept Isabel's letter in the wooden box, but its sentence had already been lived. Love, in the end, was not only the privilege of wealth or the authority of a clinic. It was a promise kept by hands that learned to hold, by a father who learned to show up, and by a woman who loved without the need for legal paper to prove the truth. The millionaire had rushed to fix a problem his money could not buy. It was what he did after the scream, what he admitted, what he returned, and who he let stay, that rewrote everything.